Okay, so you want to own a ranch. You picture the fence line disappearing into the horizon, a few hundred head of cattle grazing on grass you own, and a check that arrives every fall when the calves go to market. You buy the land. The grass grows for free, courtesy of rain and sunlight. The cattle eat the grass and get bigger. You sell the bigger cattle for more money than you paid for the smaller ones. It sounds like the simplest business model on earth, a machine that turns sunlight into money. That is the dream. The problem is what happens between the dream and the reality. Because almost nobody who buys a ranch to make money actually makes money from the cattle. The land underneath the cattle is doing something far more interesting and far more complicated than anyone tells you at the closing table. Here's what nobody tells you first. A cow-calf operation, the classic image of ranching, is one of the worst standalone investments in American agriculture. Appraisers who study working ranches routinely find that the cattle operation itself throws off an annual return of somewhere around 2 to 3% on the value of the land. A savings account can beat that. So why do billionaires, Fortune 500 heirs, and Saudi investment funds keep buying ranches the size of small countries? That question is the one this entire story is built around, and the answer is not what you think. Start with what you are actually buying because it is not a cattle business. A ranch behaves like a savings account that happens to require 24-hour physical labor to keep the interest compounding. The land appreciates quietly in the background, the same way a bank account collects interest, while the cattle operation on top of it is really just a way to justify the tax classification, cover some of the carrying costs, and keep the property productive enough to qualify for agricultural exemptions. The cows are not the profit engine. The cows are the maintenance fee that makes owning the real asset legal and cheaper. So what does it cost to get in? Ranch land in the United States is priced by the acre, and the acre price tells you almost everything about what kind of business you are entering. Remote range country in far west Texas can trade for around $600 an acre. A working cattle ranch with decent water and grazing might run $2,000 to $7,000 an acre. Hill country land near Austin, land that recreational buyers want more than cattlemen do, can hit $7,000, $20,000, even $30,000 an acre. Nationally, the USDA pegs average pasture land at just under $2,000 an acre, while cropland with better soil and water right sells for closer to $6,000. Multiply that by the size ranchers actually need to run cattle profitably, and the entry price becomes staggering. A single cow in dry range country might need 20 to 30 acres of grass to survive a year. Run the math on a modest herd of 500 cows, and you need somewhere between 10 and 15,000 acres just to feed them. At $3,000 an acre, that is $30 to $45 million in land alone, before a single fence post goes into the ground, before a single well is drilled, before you've hired a single cowboy. And then there is the story of what happens when a ranch this size actually changes hands. The Wagoner Ranch in North Texas is the largest ranch under a single fence in the country, more than 500,000 acres across 6 counties, founded in 1849 by a rancher who arrived with 6 horses and 242 longhorns. For 165 years, it stayed in one family. Then the family started fighting. 2 branches of the Wagoners spent more than 2 decades in court, unable to agree on whether to split the ranch or sell it whole. In 2014, a judge finally ordered it liquidated. It hit the market at $725 million, more than 4 times the previous record for a publicly known U.S. ranch sale. It took roughly a year and a half to find a buyer. In February 2016, Stan Kroenke, the sports team owner married into the Walton family fortune, closed the deal. Here's the part that matters. The broker selling the Wagoner didn't lead with the cattle. He led with everything else. The ranch carried more than 1,200 producing oil wells, pumping several 100,000 barrels a year. It sat on the Seymour Aquifer, a water source serving nearby cities. It hosted a wind farm generating over 300 megawatts of electricity. It had 30,000 acres of cultivated cropland, hunting rights, and a real estate broker openly telling potential buyers they could double their money by leasing to hunters instead of running more cattle. The cattle were mentioned almost as an afterthought, alongside the horses and the antique inventory. That is the hidden money. The obvious product, beef, is rarely the most profitable thing happening on the land. Underneath almost every large American ranch sits a second business most customers never think about: mineral rights. Oil, gas, and now increasingly wind and solar leases. A rancher who owns the mineral estate underneath the grass can collect royalty checks whether or not a single calf is born that year. Energy companies pay for the right to drill, and then pay again on every barrel produced, all without disturbing much of the grazing above it. Wind turbines lease footprints smaller than a backyard while paying tens of thousands of dollars a year per turbine, and the cattle keep grazing directly underneath them. Water is its own economy entirely. In the arid West, a ranch with senior water rights, meaning a legal claim to river or aquifer water older and more secure than everyone else's claim, can be worth dramatically more than an identical ranch without it, because water rights in dry states are transferable, sellable, and increasingly scarce. None of this shows up in the postcard image of a rancher on horseback. It shows up in a filing cabinet in the ranch office, where the actual money is negotiated by landmen and attorneys, not cowboys. But before any of this pays off, someone still has to run the visible business, and that business runs on land management decisions that function exactly like a retailer designing a store layout. A rancher who rotates cattle through smaller paddocks on a tight schedule, instead of letting them roam one enormous pasture all year, can meaningfully increase the pounds of beef the same acreage produces, because concentrated grazing followed by rest lets grass recover faster and cattle put on weight more efficiently. Where you place a water tank determines where cattle congregate, which determines which parts of the range get overgrazed into uselessness and which stay healthy for decades. It is the same logic a mall developer uses when deciding where to put the escalator. Design decisions upstream determine revenue downstream, just measured in pounds of beef instead of dollars per square foot. Now look at what happens on the cost side, because this is where the fantasy starts to collapse. A cow-calf operation carries a brutal mix of fixed and unpredictable costs. Property taxes come due whether or not the cattle market cooperates that year, though most states offer reduced agricultural valuations, which is part of why ranchers keep running cattle even when it barely breaks even. Fencing has to be maintained across sometimes hundreds of miles. Wells and water systems fail. Veterinary care, feed supplementation during drought, and hay to get a herd through winter when the grass runs out are not optional expenses. They are the difference between a living herd and a dead one. Labor is scarce and increasingly expensive. Ranching journals have started openly discussing a shortage of experienced cowboys willing to do the work. And then there is debt. Buying land at $3,000 to $10,000 an acre almost always means financing it. And financing means interest payments that arrive every month regardless of whether the cattle market is up or down, whether it rained or didn't, whether beef prices are at record highs or have collapsed. This is the trap, and it doesn't announce itself. It starts quietly. A ranch takes on debt to expand, because expansion is how you reach the acreage where fixed costs finally get diluted across enough cattle to matter. The debt seems manageable because interest rates are low and cattle prices are strong. Then a drought hits, and grass that used to feed one cow per 20 acres now barely feeds one cow per 30, so herds have to shrink just to survive, which means less revenue precisely when the loan payments are unchanged. Or interest rates rise, refinancing a large loan that once looked cheap into one that no longer pencils out. One problem doesn't stay one problem. It becomes a liquidity problem, then a covenant problem, then a legal problem. Cody Easterday ran one of the most respected farming and ranching operations in Washington state, a business built by his family across generations, spanning more than 20,000 acres, growing onions and potatoes and running massive cattle feedlots. Easterday had a side arrangement with Tyson Foods, one of the largest meat packers in the country. Tyson would pay Easterday to feed cattle on Tyson's behalf, reimbursing him for the cost of raising animals that Tyson technically owned. It worked for years. Then Easterday began billing Tyson for cattle that did not exist, roughly 200,000 fictitious animals, using the phantom reimbursements to cover mounting losses from an entirely separate habit, gambling on cattle futures contracts, where he ultimately lost more than $200 million. The fraud held together as long as cattle prices moved the way his bets predicted. In 2020, Easterday's father died in a highway collision with a semi-truck. Weeks later, the fictitious cattle scheme unraveled. Tyson filed an 8K with the Securities and Exchange Commission, forced to restate 4 years of its own earnings because of losses tied to Easterday. Tyson sued for $225 million. In February 2021, both Easterday Ranches and Easterday Farms filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Regulators later ordered Cody Easterday to pay $233 million in restitution and a $30 million fine. The lesson isn't that Easterday was reckless from the start. Bridging cash flow gaps with a trusted buyer's reimbursements is a completely ordinary practice in the cattle business. The structural weakness was that a legitimate financing relationship, built on trust between a rancher and a packer, could be quietly repurposed to cover unrelated losses for years before anyone downstream noticed the cattle didn't exist. Scale hid the fraud. Scale also made the eventual collapse enormous. A second, quieter version of the same trap played out at Mellencamp Cattle in Idaho, an operation running well over 100,000 head of dairy and beef cattle across 5 divisions. In 2019, the family borrowed roughly $250 million to build a state-of-the-art dairy expansion, expecting to double capacity. By the time construction finished in 2021, one lender had tightened the terms of its operating line of credit so aggressively that complying with the new terms would have triggered a default with the other lender. The company hadn't made a single reckless bet. It had simply financed a large, sensible-looking expansion with 2 different creditors whose terms turned out to be incompatible under stress. And by 2024, the business was fighting through Chapter 11 to survive. Different mechanism. Same trap, debt taken on during good times, refinanced or renegotiated once conditions shift, and a business that looked stable a year earlier suddenly isn't. So who actually wins in this industry? Not the operator running a few hundred cows on a few thousand acres, hoping beef prices hold. The winners are the ones who stopped thinking of the ranch as a cattle business at all. The Wagoner model, oil, water, wind, cropland, hunting, and cattle stacked on the same acreage, works because each revenue stream has a different risk profile. When cattle prices fall, oil royalties might be rising. When drought kills the grazing, the wind still blows and the turbines still spin. Diversification doesn't just reduce risk. On enough acreage, it multiplies the number of businesses one piece of land can quietly run at once. Scale changes almost everything else too. A rancher with a few hundred cows pays close to the same veterinary call-out fee, the same insurance minimum, the same equipment cost per cow as a rancher with 10,000, but spreads it across far fewer animals. A ranch large enough to negotiate directly with meat packers, lock in forward contracts, or lease mineral and wind rights to energy companies gains pricing power a small operator will never see. At the very largest scale, land itself becomes collateral for cheaper financing, which lowers the cost of the debt that smaller operators are crushed by. The same business model that loses money at 500 acres becomes a diversified, multi-industry holding at 500,000. The future of ranching is being shaped by forces that have almost nothing to do with cattle prices. Renewable energy leasing is expanding fast, because ranchland is exactly the flat, sun-soaked, wind-swept, thinly populated real estate that solar and wind developers want, and leasing a footprint for turbines or panels pays a rancher whether or not it ever rains again. Carbon credit markets are starting to pay landowners for how they manage soil and grass, turning grazing practices into a second export beyond beef. Water rights are becoming more valuable as cities and industry compete with agriculture for the same aquifers, particularly across the drought-prone West. And regulatory risk cuts both ways. In California, A decades-long legal battle over ranching inside the Point Reyes National Seashore ended in 2026 with a settlement that paid ranchers to leave the federal land entirely. A reminder that political and environmental pressure can end a ranching operation as decisively as a bad balance sheet. So does owning a ranch actually make financial sense? At small scale, running a few hundred cattle on a few thousand acres, the honest answer is usually no, not as a standalone business. The return on the cattle alone rarely beats a government bond, and the operator is exposed to weather, disease, and commodity price swings with almost no way to hedge them away. At a healthier scale, a few thousand cows across tens of thousands of acres with even one secondary revenue stream, mineral rights, hunting leases, or a renewable energy contract, the economics start to work, because fixed costs finally spread across enough animals and acres to matter. At the scale of a Wagoner or a King Ranch, cattle become almost incidental. The business is land, water, energy, and mineral rights, with cattle grazing on top as a tax-efficient, historically resonant way to keep the whole machine legally classified as agriculture. So if you do decide to own a ranch, understand what you are actually buying. You are not buying cattle. You are buying an option on everything underneath and above the grass. The oil, the water, the wind, the view, and decades of quiet appreciation, with a herd of cattle grazing on top mostly to keep the tax man satisfied that the land is still working. The fence line looks the same as it did in 1849. The business hiding behind it never stops changing.